Hi everyone, welcome to Rafinger's webinar on General Data Protection Regulation, commonly known as GDPR. My name is Suda. I'm one of the partners at Rafinger's, and with me I've got Mehul here, who is a associate partner. To start with, a bit of housekeeping. To avoid any background noise disturbances, we have you on mute. So if you've got any questions, you will see at the bottom of the screen there's a Q&A. If you press the Q&A, a pop-up window should open up. You can type your question in there and send it to us. We will try and answer as many questions as possible at the end of the seminar, and we've already got some questions and we will try and answer them first. The presentation, we will send you a copy of the presentation with the useful links and contact details either tomorrow or early next week. This webinar is one of 3 webinars we're going to do for GDPR for charities. This is an introduction. We will do another more detailed, in-depth one around January time. So watch out for that. And we'll also do another one in April, which will be kind of a month before GDPR kicks in. So watch out for those two. Just to quickly give you a brief background to myself and Mehul here. Myself, I oversee the firm's charity sector. I also oversee the firm's IT, which means I closely work with the IT manager in implementing the GDPR of the firm. Mehul is in our audit, accountancy and tax services, and he's our in-house GDPR specialist. I'm not going to hand over to Mehul to start the presentation.
Morning all. So GDPR, what is GDPR and does it apply to you? So essentially, a lot has been sort of discussed and commented on GDPR since its sort of inception, and over the last year or so, there's been a lot that commentary in the press, and then also just between various firms of advisors. And I think there's been, traditionally, it looks like there's been a lot of scaremongering amongst various individuals about what GDPR applies to. So hopefully, from our presentation today and our webinar and things we can discuss with you, we should be able to sort of clarify some of the main rules and understand where you guys stand in relation to GDPR. So firstly, GDPR, it comes into application really into the UK from the 25th of May 2018. Now, one of the key things that I want to mention today is GDPR is a bit of EU legislation essentially, and given the prolonged exit that we have from the EU at the moment, the government have actually confirmed, and they've explicitly confirmed to say that the UK's decision to leave the EU will not affect the commencement of GDPR. So therefore, we've got to continue as per normal. So for those Eurosceptics out there who unfortunately thought that GDPR was going to essentially disappear once we leave the EU, that's not going to happen. Moving on to this, in terms of who does GDPR apply to? So Article 1 of GDPR actually states that the regulation lays down the rules relating to the protection of natural persons regarding the processing of personal data. So what does that actually mean? It means that GDPR actually applies to individuals and not companies. So if you're a limited company, your personal data is not necessarily, as a company, sort of caught up in GDPR, whereas as an individual it is. Moving on from this, in terms of the whole sort of controllers and processors concept that you've probably seen mentioned, this is something I just wanted to sort of clarify for you guys. The definitions are pretty much broadly the same under the Data Protection Act. The controller says how and why the personal data is processed, whereas a processor actually acts on the controller's behalf. So what does this actually mean in practice? So as a charity, you're probably going to be a controller and a processor. So you own the data that you've collected and you actually use it for your benefit. So you're a controller and a processor. Whereas for us as an accountancy firm, we probably control our own data. We use it as well as a processor, but then we outsource sometimes for various different things. So we use processors out there. So at the end of the day, you need to understand where you fit into as a charity. Are you a controller or a processor, or are you both? If you are a controller, it's important to note that you are not relieved of your obligations where a processor is involved. In fact, GDPR places further obligations on you to ensure that your contracts with processors are compliant with GDPR effectively. So one of those key things you need to understand is where you outsource your any sort of process or any sort of function, you need to make sure that your contract that you have with that particular third party is compliant with GDPR.
Right, there's a couple of good points here, right? GDPR does not apply to corporate bodies, right? It only applies to individual data, right?
That's correct, yeah.
That's correct. And the second thing is we as an accountancy firm, we are both controllers and processors as well. So GDPR applies to us. So a lot of the charities out there, Mehul, are going to be controllers, right? They're not going to be, there are that many charities, there's going to be processors like what the work that we do. For example, processor means that we do bookkeeping work and we also do payroll work. For other third parties, so the charities who are doing similar work, you will come under both processors and controllers, right? That's correct.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. So I think you need to understand as a charity where you really stand with this, because essentially you're going to be definitely a controller, but it's just whether you're a processor as well or whether you use third parties to process your information. So like I said, it's important to distinguish where you stand with this. Moving on to the next slide. What I want to quickly just jump onto now is actually understanding the type of information that GDPR applies to. And what we've done, just for the benefit of keeping it very, very simple, is we've actually split this into two: personal data and sensitive personal data. Now, like the old Data Protection Act, effectively, GDPR applies to personal data. But where it slightly differs is that the GDPR's definition is a little bit more detailed, and it makes it clear that information such as online identifiers, so for example, this could be an IP address, can be personal data. So essentially, the definition under GDPR of personal data is a little bit more expansive, if you want to say. And the reason for that, I presume, is because essentially the way our changing technology and the way in which we collect information on certain individuals and certain people has changed in the last 10 years with the advancements we've had in technology. So really and truly, the GDPR is actually catching up with this to make sure it actually keeps up to date with technology and what we're doing at the moment. The next thing I want to talk about is sensitive personal data. Now, sensitive personal data, again, it's referred to in GDPR as special categories of personal data, and this relates to genetic or biometric data. And so at the end of the day, if you're a charity that does research as well, you need to understand that there's going to be data that you use for research purposes that can also fall under the GDPR regulation. Moving on to the next slide, what I actually want to talk about now is the GDPR principles. So again, like we've sort of introduced you to GDPR at the moment, what we want to do is give you a brief overview of GDPR. And as Suda mentioned, in our later webinars, we'll be taking you through some more detail in GDPR and how that can actually apply to charities. So I just want to get a real good overview of what the principles are. Now, as you'll see on the screen, there are 7 principles which we've listed there. I'm not going to go through each of those because that would be quite time consuming. One thing to note is that the top 6 principles are exactly pretty much the same as they were under the old Data Protection Act. And so therefore, not much has changed. The only change that we're seeing under GDPR is now the accountability principle. Now, essentially, what does this accountability principle relate to, and what does it essentially mean? Well, essentially, what it means is that it requires you to demonstrate that you comply with the principles that we've stated above, so those 6 principles, and state explicitly that this is your responsibility. Now, the common question that we get asked is, how do I show that I'm accountable? How do I show that I'm going to be complying with these principles? And so I've just got a list of a few things, and again, we can circulate this in our notes to you after in terms of a couple of things that you should be doing to ensure that you comply and you are accountable under the GDPR principles. Firstly, what you should be doing is implementing some appropriate measures for internal data protection. So looking at staff training, internal audits, and just review of your internal policies, really. I think it's just making sure you understand what policies and procedures you have in place. Maintain a relevant documentation on processing activities. So make sure you've documented processes and procedures and actually what you're using that data for. I think what you've really got to do is inherently design a system that takes data protection and designs data protection into your process, into your systems inherently, and really it works it out in a way where it's not something difficult for you to do. It's inherently designed in your process for you to actually understand that data protection is key. A couple of just quick tips. What you can be doing as a charity is looking at data minimization, looking at the data that you actually collect and understand, do we really need all that data? So for example, you could be collecting 10 or 15 different identifiers for a potential donor, where you actually may only require 2 or 3. So you really need to look at data minimization. The next thing to really think about is transparency. So really allowing individuals to monitor the processing. So really understanding that, you know, your data subjects have access to whatever data you're using for them, and at the same time they can understand how you're actually really processing that. And like I said, overall with GDPR, I think it's one of those things where you've got to create and improve security features on an ongoing basis. As soon as GDPR comes into comes into apply next year, I genuinely believe this is not something that we should be looking at as a one-off. We should be continually looking at our security and continually looking at how we can improve this as our organizations change and as our data requirements change, really. Moving on to the next slide, just a couple of questions that we've had before the actual webinar was around retaining personal data. Now, I think this is something that's, you know, has been talked about a lot, and unfortunately, under the GDPR legislation, it's not specifically, I suppose, it's not specifically defined. There is no specific minimum or maximum period where you should be holding data. So it doesn't explicitly say that you should hold data for 7 years or 8 years or so and so. What they do say is that personal data that is processed for any particular purpose should not be kept longer than is necessary. So at the same time, it says that you shouldn't be keeping it for a minimum maximum period of time, but only keep it for as and when you'll need the actual data. And we've just listed a couple of steps on here for charities and to be honest, most organisations to take to ensure that they're retaining personal data for the correct amount of time. So I believe firstly what you should be doing is reviewing the length of time you keep your personal data, securely deleting information that is no longer required. And I think that's quite important because as firms, you know, as an accountancy practice, we over time have accumulated a huge amount of information, and so we've had to go through a process internally to understand, you know, is this information still required and can we get rid of it because we probably won't need it going forward. And I suppose the third and final thing which leads on nicely from this is to update, archive and securely delete information when it goes out of date. So I think that's one of the things where what you need to do is always continuously review your data and understand that is it still being used, is it still required, and if not, you can archive it or just securely delete it.
Yeah. For example, we are an accountancy firm here, so what happens is we are required to keep data for 7 years for tax purposes. So that's one of the things that we do. For charities, you may not need to keep for 7 years information. For example, if donor has given you money and hasn't given you anything for 5 years, do you really need to keep that information of that donor? You know, you have to. The charities have to. You have to look at each individual case and say, right, this donor hasn't given us anything for say 3, 4, 5 years. Is it necessary to keep that person's details with you for more than 3 years? You need to have your own system, a process that you say, right, after this certain period, we're going to delete information related to this donor because he's no longer giving us any donations. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, and the point I just want to make very quickly on this is that there is not sort of one size fits all. And I think that's something that's interesting with retention of personal data. Every organization, if you're a charity or if you're a limited company, every organization is very, very different. And so therefore, different time periods will apply. There's not sort of one general policy in terms of retention of personal data. So for every charity out there, you'll have your own requirements, you'll have your own obligations that you do internally, and therefore you need to judge yourselves in terms of the different types of data that you do have, whether you're keeping that for a sufficient amount of time, because there could be instances where you're not holding data for long enough. And so therefore, you know, it's the flip side of it. You really need to understand what data you hold, the requirements, why you hold it, what you're processing it for, and is it still valid, and really move on from there. Moving on to the next slide, and like I said, we're just going to give you a brief overview of the main things of GDPR. And what I want to talk about here is the actual conditions for using personal data. Now, as you can see, there's 6 conditions on the slide. I'm not going to go through all of them. What I am going to go through is just the first one, which is consent, which seems to be, I suppose, the most talked about condition under GDPR. And what it does mention is that under GDPR, if you can satisfy one or more of these conditions for processing, then you can continue as you do. You can continue to process that personal data for individuals. So whenever you receive anything in terms of personal data or you're collecting any information, it's always good to have a sense check and have a look down this list and say, hold on a minute, have we actually met these conditions? Are we actually ticking these boxes? And as long as you tick one of these boxes, you're good to carry on as far as I'm concerned. Now, in terms of talking about consent essentially is defined in the legislation under Article 4.11. If you're very, very interested, go and read up about it. It's quite a mouthful, but essentially what it talks about is that the individual whose personal data you're holding, so that data subject's information, they need to give you explicit wishes and affirmative action to say, you know what, you can go ahead and actually use my data, you can go ahead and actually process it. And I suppose this is very, very interesting because something what we've looked at internally for ourselves is that we have a marketing system that our marketing department which holds all the email addresses of current clients, prospective clients, and people's information that we've just collected over time. And one thing that I want to really pick up on today, and something that charities and accountancy firms alike are going to be, I suppose, really struggling with to understand is, can we still continue to send marketing emails? Can we still continue to send information emails if you're a charity to these individuals? Now, it's important to note that all electronic marketing is actually governed by the Privacy, Electronic and Communications Regulation, which is commonly known as PECR. Now, essentially, what you need to understand is that the rules here for marketing emails are different for individuals as they are for corporate bodies. Now, the way I see it is that if you're an individual and you've collected that individual's, let's say, for example, email address, what you need to do is, at the point in which you collect that data, you need to ask that individual whether they can opt in or whether they are happy for you to send them information. So that's what I like to call the initial opt-in. And then as you continue to send them data and as you continue to send them information about your charity, you need to provide them with the option to opt out and stop receiving this information. So essentially, it's a two-way approach, basically. You give them the chance to opt in initially when you first collect the data, and you give them the chance to opt out on an ongoing process as you send that information to them.
Yeah, our understanding is that, for example, if you take us, my name and my email address is on our website. So if you go to Raffinger's website, you'll see my email address there. So I am giving consent for somebody to send me email, right? That's how it works, isn't it?
Yeah, so, definitely. Yeah.
So if your details on the website, that means you're actually giving consent to contact you, right?
Yeah, definitely. And one thing I was going to mention is, as we just mentioned earlier, is that the rules are different for individuals and corporate bodies. Now, we've talked about the rules for the individuals, the opt-in at the beginning and the continuous chance to opt out as we proceed. Now, for corporate bodies, GDPR is not actually applicable, as we mentioned at the beginning of our presentation. Now, for corporate bodies, I genuinely feel the best way to approach this is to do as we are for individuals, to give them the chance to opt in at the beginning and give them the chance to opt out as you go and as you progress. Now, what's interesting is where you have an individual working for a corporate organization. And so I genuinely feel that's a slightly gray area. And so therefore, I'll always be on the side of caution to make sure that we apply the rules properly and make sure that you actually get them the chance to opt in to begin with and the chance to opt out as we progress.
So what happens with people who are on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook? Can we contact them?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because it was something that we were talking about quite a lot recently, actually, because as an accountancy practice, we would openly market ourselves on social media, for example, LinkedIn, and we would have our profiles up there, we would have our contact details up there. And so what we're doing in that instance is we're saying to people, contact us, we're happy to be contacted and we're happy to provide a service. And so therefore, I genuinely feel like we're giving consent for individuals to contact us. So as far as social media goes, I think if an individual's contact details are on social media, they put that on there themselves. And so therefore, they've provided essentially everyone out there consent to be contacted. So essentially, it's really judgment and what it comes down to as an individual and what you want to do with your personal data. Moving on to the next slide, and this is something that we've just wanted to briefly touch on, is GDPR under different conditions. And I know we've got a few guys from different charities that are children specific, that are related to children. So what we want to do is actually talk about how GDPR is applicable for children. One of the key things that GDPR talks about is where we have online services for children, and it explicitly states that if you offer online services to children, you need to obtain consent from a parent or guardian to process that child's data. So for our charities out there that are actually being in contact with children and offering some sort of online services or support, you need to make sure that you are complying with these rules going forward. The next bit I just wanted to talk about again is data under special categories. So we briefly mentioned it earlier in terms of the different types of data that we collect, the personal information, and then essentially what I like to call the sensitive personal information. So examples of this can include race, I suppose your political views, and as we mentioned previously, genetic and biometric data, which could be, I suppose, quite relevant for some charities that are actually using it for research purposes. Now, GDPR has, again, conditions in place, as it has for personal information, it has conditions in place for data in special categories, data in these sensitive and personal data categories, essentially. And again, they are very, very similar to the personal information, but they're just, I suppose they've got a larger list in there and what boxes you can tick, because I suppose this data is sensitive, and so therefore they need to give you more of a scope to make sure you comply. So again, you've got the usuals in terms of making sure you've got consent if you're doing something under legal proceedings, then also if you're doing some sort of scientific and historical research, which some charities may be doing as well. So it's really making sure that you've met these conditions for processing sensitive data and really going on from there. Just moving on to again, like I said, just one of the other bits that's picked up by GDPR and making sure you understand and get a brief overview of GDPR is looking at data subject rights. Now, under GDPR, there are 8 data subject rights, and you can see them on your screen at the moment in our slideshow. Now, I'm not going to go through each of these, and again, the explanations and the background to each of these are available on the ICO's website. So this is something that you can always go onto and get more of an understanding into. I'm just going to touch on a few of those. The first being the right of access. Now, what this really means is what information is an individual entitled to under the GDPR. So I suppose what it does mean is that under the GDPR, individuals will have the right to obtain confirmation that their data is being processed, access to their personal data, so really understanding what data you hold for them. But at the same time, this could also include any other supplementary information. So for example, going down privacy notices, which is something we will touch on in our subsequent webinars. The next one I want to go on to is the right of rectification, which is quite interesting because at what point do you decide when personal data should be rectified? And what GDPR says essentially is that individuals have the entitlement essentially to rectify their personal data if it is inaccurate or incomplete. So essentially, if you hold some data for an individual and it's, I suppose, incorrect, then that individual is in their own right to come back to you and correct that data. Whether that will happen in practice, only time will tell. And the final data subject right now I want to talk about, and it's probably, I suppose, the most common one that is spoken about and is the most commented one, is the right to erasure. And essentially, the right to erasure is also known as the right to be forgotten. And the broad principle underpinning this is that any individual is, I suppose, basically, they can request the deletion or removal of their personal data where there is no compelling reason for that continued data to be processed. So there's no particular reason for you to hold that data. You just had it. For example, you took this individual, this donor's data 20 years ago, and he made a donation, he or she made a donation 20 years ago, and you decided at that point to keep that data on your database. That individual is within their right to come to you and say, look, you're not using this for any compelling reason. You're not using this for a particular process. So therefore, can you remove my details from your database? And so, this is something, if you're a charity and you're communicating with these individuals regularly and you're sending them some sort of information, if they're not doing anything with it, they're within their right to turn around and say to you, take us off your database. So it's something really to watch out for and to understand as a charity whether there are data subject rights that are more applicable to you and going to be more relevant to you going forward.
But data subject rights is something that's going to affect us as well as accountancy firm. So we will be going in a lot more detail in our January GDPR webinar, right?
Yeah, because it's interesting because we have we've got a portfolio of clients that we look after, and those clients, for example, if we've stopped acting for an individual, legally in terms of looking at the HMRC legislation and making sure that we hold data for their financial data for a number of years, they could come out to us and say, after 7-8 years, they might turn around and say to us that we want you to basically remove all our data from your system. And so we really need to make sure that, we need to go through our databases. We need to understand if there's any data on there that we've held for a long period of time and really take it from there to understand how we process that and move on. The next slide we're just going to go on to is a breach notification. Now, this is where I genuinely believe the scaremongering in GDPR has come from. A lot of the breaches and I suppose the fines and penalties as a result of breaches, I think that's what's really scared people to get GDPR compliant. Now, before we go into it, what I want you guys to understand is what a personal data breach means. A breach is essentially a breach of security leading to the destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data. So as you can see in that definition, a breach is more than just losing personal data. It's more than just misplacing a USB key somewhere. I think what you need to understand is where you may possibly have gaps in your data security. And when you have a breach, what do you do at that point, and how do you actually act? I think one of the key things to note as well, and what we've put on there on the second point, is a notifiable breach has to be reported to the relevant supervisory authority. So in our circumstance here in the UK, the ICO, within 72 hours of the organisation becoming aware of it. And so if you were to actually practically think about that, if you were to have a data security breach at some point, and hopefully it does not happen to organizations out there, but if it were to happen, you need to have a policy and a plan in place, because 72 hours is not a long time for you to get your house in order and at the same time notify the ICO. So you really need to make sure that your data security is in order, and in the worst case scenario, you have some sort of plan in place if things were to go wrong, and what your action plan should be. And it's important to note that failing to notify a breach when required to do so can result in significant fines, and these fines are up to 10 million euros or 2% of your global turnover. So this is where the scaremongering comes into, because essentially they've got some serious fines and penalties in place if you aren't GDPR compliant.
You've seen the recent news, the Paradise paper issue. There's a lot of information coming about wealthy individuals and companies, what they're doing. So what we're trying to say to you is, if you've got wealthy donors, your charity might have wealthy donors giving you money. So if there is a breach and you don't want to be hit with penalties and fines, so it's best to contact ICO within 72 hours of the breach that you having the knowledge of breach, isn't it? That's how it works.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what it comes down to is how you plan in the worst instance. It's like having a disaster recovery plan. It's a similar sort of concept. You need to make sure you've got some sort of plan in place that will allow you to act efficiently and quickly to ensure that you've dealt with the breach and you've notified the ICO within the time frame, because essentially failure to do so can have significant consequences. Next bit, which is our final slide, and then we can move on to the questions for today, is probably the most interesting slide for many of you, is because what we've done is we've had a little brainstorm over on our side for a few weeks to understand what can a charity do in order to become GDPR compliant. And as I mentioned, we will circulate this round to you after the webinar, just so you've got a bit of an action plan to go from. Now, the first thing, as you can see on my slide here, is that I believe you should complete a data protection impact assessment. Now, what is a data protection impact assessment? Well, it allows the data controller, so in your case, the charity, to analyze the origin, nature, and severity of the risk to data subject rights and freedoms. Now, in broad terms, the aim is to establish where there is a risk and determine the measures to put in place to protect the data and comply with GDPR. Now, essentially, what kind of information can the data protection impact assessment contain? Well, it can have a description of the processing operations that you have in place, and the purposes of these processes that you have in place, an assessment of the risks to the individuals from these processes, and really go on to the actual measures that you have in place to address these risks, including any security that you might have in place. And it's important to note that you need to demonstrate that you comply as well. You really need to demonstrate that you comply with GDPR and your data security complies with GDPR. And one important point I want to note on this, a data protection impact assessment can really go on to various different parts of your organization. It can't be limited to one project. You can do these sort of impact assessments at various different areas of the organization to ensure that you have the right data security in place. The next bit I want to actually move on to is the completion of an information asset register. And now this is something when we were looking at internally, it was my biggest recommendation internally for our own firm. I said, we need to complete an information asset register, and we need to understand where our data is, who is responsible for it, what type of data do we hold? Because as an organization, we have various departments, and we've got data from different locations within these departments. And so this information asset register and completing this information audit, as I like to call it, will really help us understand where the data is, what type of data it is, and who is responsible for looking after that data. And if you're a large charity, this is a significant exercise, and I think this will be very, very beneficial for many organizations out there. The third point, and something that we've actually really implemented quite well internally here, is we're training our staff on GDPR and data security, because essentially these are the guys that are the coalface of it all. They're the guys who are out there processing your data. They're the guys who are actually out there using that personal data. And so therefore, what we need to get them to understand what GDPR is, and what are the safeguards and precautions that they should be taking, and what they should be putting in place to ensure that they don't have any sort of breach. At the same time, we're educating our guys on the consequences of breaches. So a little bit of a scaremongering on our part, but showing them that this is quite a serious matter to think about.
It's very similar to money laundering. You train your staff for this. So exactly that's what we are doing here as well within the firm.
Yeah.
We're constantly training our staff to be aware of this.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny because we talked about this and money laundering side by side to make sure that our staff are adequately trained and they know exactly what safeguards and what they should implement in terms of precautions to make sure that we are secure as an organization. And the next bit I want to move on to is something that was quite interesting, because it was around in the old Data Protection Act, but I don't think it was necessarily implemented massively. It wasn't implemented on a big scale. It's actually appointing a data protection officer. And this is interesting because some organizations, and we've had some questions, if we're a small charity, we've got 2 or 3 individuals working for the charity, how do we go about doing this? But I still feel you can. I still feel like you can have a data protection officer. It's someone who can wear essentially 2 hats, someone who has one role in the organization, but at the same time is a data protection officer. And essentially the responsibilities of this data protection officer should be to oversee the GDPR process, to actually advise the controller or the processor of the data in terms of what they should be doing, engaging with the staff and really raising awareness and making sure as an organization you're compliant with the rules. Now, they don't necessarily need to be well versed in GDPR, but yes, they do need to have a basic understanding. What they need to have more of an understanding about is looking at the GDPR rules, looking at your organization and really bringing those together and making sure they understand how those GDPR rules actually apply to that organization. And the couple of final ones that I really want to talk about today in terms of next steps are actually making sure you actually review people's information that you submit to them, and actually review what you tell people and understand how you tell them. Are you sending out marketing emails? Are you sending out brochures? Really understand where your data is actually moving in your organization. And the final bit I want to move on to is actually having a GDPR action plan in place. Now, I'm going to refer you to the ICO website, because I think they've got a really good a bit of information on their website. If you were just to Google 12 steps from the ICO, this will give you your GDPR action plan. I think it's important that you can do this straight after the webinar. You can actually get a GDPR action plan in place by going onto the ICO's website, looking at their 12 steps for preparation. And what this will allow you to do is to plan for GDPR, review your current internal systems and processes, and then actually act on GDPR, making sure you're compliant.
Thank you, Mehul. There's some very interesting points there. Right, last week, ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, launched a dedicated helpline for small businesses and charities like you. So the number is on there. We called them last week. They answered the call within 2 minutes. So it seems like it's working. We didn't ask them any technical questions. We asked them some simple questions. They were able to answer it. So give it a try. If you got simple questions to ask them, give them the ring. They should be able to answer it for you. So that's a good option. The number is there. We will email you this number for you later for you to with the pack, so you can actually keep this. It's on the ICO website as well. Now on to questions now. The 2 main questions that we had it before we started was one of them was appointing a DPO. Who needs to appoint a data processing officer? What is the situation there, Mehul?
Well, essentially, when it comes down to a data protection officer, we just discussed it briefly in terms of my next steps, is to understand that an individual can wear 2 hats in an organization. Some individuals that I've spoken to in larger organizations are looking to appoint a full-time DPO. And by all means, if you have the resource to do so, yes, that is the ideal scenario. However, in practice, we do understand that organizations like ourselves and other organizations like Charities won't necessarily have someone who's a particular expert and just a DPO full time. So what you can do is have someone who wears two hats, who has an understanding of GDPR, knows the basics, but like I said, more importantly, knows about your organization, knows about where your data is, who is using it, what security we have in place, and can really advise on that by bringing the GDPR policies and regulations into place with the organization's actual footprint on data.
There was a lot of misinformation where I think there was rumors that if you employ less than 250 people, you don't need to appoint a DPO. Peter Brown, the senior technical officer at ICO, he said that's not right. So you need to look at the 3 requirements who needs to appoint a DPO. I think one of them is processes carried out by public authority. I'm not sure any of you charities are public authorities. If you are, you need to look into it. So you need to look at the 3 main requirements to appoint DPO. If not, as Mehul said, it's good practice to have one, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
The next question we always get asked, actually within the firm, we're looking at it as well, encryption of emails, right? So one of the things they're asking is end-to-end encryption of information that you are sending. I did a blog about this about a month ago with regards to Microsoft. They're pretty charity friendly. If you go on their website, they give you good offers for charities to use their Office 365 option. There's an option called E3. I don't know why they call it E3. There's E3, E4, and the top one is E5. E3 is the basic one. If you subscribe to that, you also get an end-to-end encryption email facility. So what happens is when you send the email out to a potential donor, first time there's a passcode they will put in. And after that, that donor can open your email, because that email address of the donor will be registered with Microsoft, and then only that donor can open it. So you are actually covering yourself in terms of encryption end to end. From you to the donor, he's put in a passcode, and then only he opened it. So the system recognized that he's an authorized person to open that email, and it works. So it's a good system. I think Google do the same thing as well. So if you are with Google, speak to them. If you're not, use the Microsoft one. Microsoft one is really good because with the OneDrive, you can also save your information securely on their OneDrive. So for the subscription that you're going to pay for E3, this covers everything. Yep. You got some questions?
Yeah, so we've had quite a few questions before the webinar started. Actually, we've had quite a few questions emailed over to us. So I'm just going to try and cover. We've tried to cover as many of those as we can in the actual presentation. And one thing we do want to note is we did have our Charities email address on the previous slide, which we're just going to recirculate. By all means, whatever questions that we don't get a chance to cover today, you can email the charities-help@raffingers.co.uk, and we will endeavour to answer all questions as quick as we can, as best as we can. So we are here to help, and we feel like there's going to be different questions that different charities will have, because every organisation is going to be completely different. And one of the key things that I suppose I want to talk about is actually reviewing your data. Now, I've had quite a few questions about, especially in the age that we're in with technology, about how quickly data can age. So, for example, people's data can become pretty much out of date after a year or two. And so I think it's important that you regularly review your data and you update your information if it goes out of date. Because essentially you could be holding information on your system that is no longer relevant. And I think it's important that what you do going forward is just making sure that you're continuously reviewing it. And what we've seen at the moment is that organizations are now reviewing their data after 10, 15, 20 years, just in response to GDPR. And this was interesting because as far as I suppose the legislation was concerned, it should be something that you're doing year by year and on a regular basis. And it's something that we talked about internally between ourselves to say, you know what, we should be every year looking at all the data we hold and saying, this data we no longer use, it's no longer up to date, we can just get rid of it. And it lowers your risk as an organization because you're holding less information, you're less likely to get caught by anything if you're holding less information. And I suppose that's more relevant nowadays, given the various security breaches we're seeing and the advancements in technology and hacking and that sort of thing. So it's important that you minimize the amount of data you use and you hold, essentially. Was there any other questions? I was going to say we've got quite a number questions on the Q&A box. So what we'll do is I want to sort of try and make sure we cover as many questions in the presentations which we have, and then also cover questions in your questions that have come over to us. So we'll just have a quick scroll through these.
What is the difference between GDPR and PECR?
So going back, so I believe that was on the...
The question is, what is the difference between GDPR and PECR, or do they overlap? That's a mouthful there.
Well, essentially, there is overlap, as we've mentioned, because the overlap is with the marketing emails. So the marketing emails, essentially, as we talked about, for individuals are covered in GDPR. But marketing emails generally, in terms of looking at individuals, corporate bodies, and that sort of thing, is covered by the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, so PECR. So it's important to distinguish that. Now, essentially, the marketing emails for individuals are overlapped in both. So it's just making sure, as I mentioned, you have that initial consent and that ongoing consent. So I'm hoping that answers that question.
There's a question about, is there a regulatory body that oversees compliance with GDPR? Essentially, ICO does all of that, isn't it? They are the main body.
Yeah, I suppose, like I said, there is no sort of I suppose, like we talked about, I think there's no sort of organization that can go out there and really look at every individual firm and making sure that.
But ICO are the main body that's gonna come up with penalties and fines if you're in breach of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's just making sure that you notify the ICO about breaches. They're not going to come out looking for you, but at the same time, you need to notify the ICO and go from there.
We're running out of time now. Actually, I'm going to wrap this up quite quickly. There are a lot of questions here. We will come back to you. We'll try and answer them. We'll come back to you. We'll email you the answers. Keep sending those questions to the email address I've got there on the screen. Just to wrap it up, the key 3 points that I've got here for you is, one is you need to do a data audit. This should be an urgent priority for anybody. If you haven't started on this GDPR journey, you need to do a data audit as soon as possible. Just to give you what a data audit means is assigning, you just basically having a look at your data to see if the data that you hold is fit for the charity's purposes. That's all the data audit is. You're looking to see the data that you hold is fit for the charity's purposes. The second thing is you need to ensure that you are taking steps to comply with it. So, when the ICO come knocking at your door, you need to find out that, you are making steps to comply with it. It's no good you just sitting there and saying, okay, I've got this. You need to document it and make sure it's all written, and you can, give it to them and say, look, we're doing all of this, we're doing our best. The third point is there's a lot of uncertainty, right? 100% compliance is unlikely, and it's going to be unrealistic. As far as we think, it's going to be very unrealistic. If you go to the ICO website, it says that ICO website, they have a blog there where they're saying we have a big stick, but we're not going to hit anybody with it. Yeah, they have a big stick, they're not going to hit anybody with it yet. So be mindful of that. It is overnight, they're not going to start, throwing penalties and fines, but you have to prepare yourself. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you for joining. What we will do is that there'll be another more in-depth one with a lot of examples, and we will give you specific to your charities. We'll take the questions that you asked us and we will put that together and have another webinar in January. Thank you for joining.